Hello, everyone, and welcome to this LinkedIn Live event, the first one after the summer break. I hope you enjoyed your vacation and you're full of energy and ready to learn today about the exciting words of key accounts management, right? Those relationship between an important customer and a strategic vendor. And we have the pleasure to have with us today Antonio Pavese, former colleague at Merck, that indeed a global director for key account management at the Merck Group, and will share us some insight on this world of key accounts. I will ask Antonio to introduce himself. First of all, I want to give a warm welcome to all the participants that are joining with us. In particular, I just arrived this morning from Tunisia, where I was running a 4-day workshop for an executive MBA class, and I'm happy to see that some of the Tunisian executive MBA students are there joining the workshop with us. So thank you very much for being with us. But let's get started with the topic of today. And how about asking Antonio to briefly introduce himself?
First of all, hi, Giuseppe and everybody. Thanks for having me here. I'm Antonio. I am Global Account Director at the Merck Group, Darmstadt. Prior to this role, I had long experience in the chemical industry at Dow in several commercial roles, product management, sales management, and strategy, and then an experience with General Electric in the life science domain. And now I manage the overall relationship with the top important account for Merck in the pharma and biopharma group.
Excellent, Antonio. Thank you very much. Tell us what's global accounts expect today by strategic vendors. How do they define partnership?
I will say as a start, Giuseppe, that the global account are a busy group, a busy club those days. They are adding to their busy plate new important chapters. On the one hand, they are busy digitalizing the operation, for example. They are also working on adding ESG scorecards to their key performance indicators. And lastly, they are rethinking heavily supply chain for resiliency after the COVID experience. They need to deliver all of those things really quickly, and they are adding on top of already busy agendas. As a consequence of that, they are expecting their top vendors to support and help in the process. And therefore, global vendors are often requested to take on board part of important steps that in the past were completely and exclusively internal, for example, product development, as well as production at scale in occasions. So in this context of important addition of the scorecard into new dimensions, as discussed, and where accounts are busy delivering on short timelines, global partners are supposed to deliver solutions which tend to be scalable globally and converge on standards. And the standard is important because it allows global accounts to manage their cost and to manage the operation more effectively. So partnership today is to accept to take part in those endeavors, take part in those projects, absorb some of the complexity, and embed services and products together in solutions that help the customer to make sense of them and use them quickly.
Interesting, Antonio. So let's build, on those changes which are taking place. What is the new definition of value, and how does value creation and value sharing happen?
So in this new configuration, value is precisely defined. In my experience, value is an improvement in one or more than one of the key performance indicators which are present in the customer executive agenda. Those tend to be traditionally financial metrics, for example, working capital or cost or productivity or yield, as we all know. But as discussed, more recently, they incorporate new metrics. For example, what is the carbon footprint of your supply, Mr. Vendor? Or what is the score of diversity and inclusion in my organization, but also in my strategic partner supplier organization. In this context, then, once the value is defined according to those metrics, value creation happens when it is agreed between the parties that the vendor has a viable solution, a technology, a process, an opportunity that truly improve at least one of the parameters of the KPI in the customer agenda. For this to happen, some prerequisites are necessary. Number one is that the parties define value in a way which is agreed, meaning that whatever definition, for example, a financial definition, it is accepted by both parties and is measured in the same way. This is the most important parameter. Also, for this to happen, some degree of openness into the customer operation is necessary. For the vendor to be able to produce a business case that convincingly improves at least one of the parameters of their KPI, well, some degree of understanding of what the customer really cares about, what are the bottlenecks, what are the issues, and the pain points have to be shared more openly than in the past to enable the business case to be meaningful. For example, let's assume that in my field, a new generation of cell processing equipment, which is designed for the cell therapy space, is produced and offered. The promise would be to eliminate the need of pre-treating the blood and the cell of the patient prior to the processing the equipment. So the promise is to eliminate the need for lab technicians and reagents and redeploy those resources elsewhere. For a global account, for this proposition to be meaningful, is necessary that we can really talk to the specific of that outfit, that operation, that therapy center, and convincingly explain how many technicians can be redeployed for this to become something viable and of interest.
Okay, well, you mentioned, indeed that, there is this degree of sharing that is needed, that is has increased versus the past. I mean, tell me a bit more, what are the negotiation circumstances that may enable or prevent a positive value creation environment?
I would say that it starts with the supplier. It is starting with us. I would say the first step is the supplier needs to accept that we need to remove from our conversation, from our offering, all the parts which are not relevant for an account at a given time. For example, because if the customer is not ready for it, or it is not really relevant for their strategic journey. And this can be going very far. It can even go to the point of modifying your commercial offering. For example, a few years back, it happens to us to be preparing successfully a proposal for upgrading the fleet of laboratory instruments of a global biopharma company to take them from the old to new generation. The deal was making sense financially, technically, and the customer was ready for it. At least the lab head were ready to sign off. But then all of a sudden, the deal got put on the freeze because there was a CapEx veto in that specific period, so the customer could not acquire new instrumentation. So the way around it was to modify the deal from a sale to a lease, so that we moved the cost position from CapEx to OpEx, and this way the deal could go through. But it's just an example, Giuseppe, to explain that when global accounts come to the fore, they come with their specific needs, and sometimes those needs are different from any other account. They are too big, they are too important, they have their own agenda, and the best companies are often ready to rethink the commercial offering to accommodate for important customer need. And that's the selling part. On the buying part, the negotiation style that helps is where the buyer accepts to remove the eye from the unit cost of acquisition of a specific consumable or equipment and enlarge it into the total cost of the part of the operation that is using that specific element, or even better and more ambitiously, into the total value creation opportunity, so that not only the driver of cost are mentioned, but also the driver of value.
Well, as a former procurement executive, I know that that's not always easy, right? Especially if within the procurement organization, then maybe the key indicator of success is cost savings, which means what you're gonna do uh, at in terms of cost, and maybe it's more challenging to measure things in terms of value. So this sounds like a successful end game, but we all know it's not that easy, right? Now, how can the party get started maybe in a controlled environment without taking too much risk?
Yeah, this is really, Giuseppe, coming to this discussion is already a second step into the trajectory towards value creation and value sharing. So this is the second step after a business case has been produced, as we discussed, according to KPIs that the customer and the buyer measure and the seller measured in the same way. And on paper, we have a business case. Now, to your point, is the time to prove, without taking too much risk, that this can really work in practice. It is the time to go into a proof of concept dimension where we now apply the idea into a real production from the real market, but we do it in a controlled way, selecting a group of products or customer which can be segregated from the main franchise, and therefore will not create damage if the risk result into a failure. Let me give an example of that. A few years back, the paint and coating world was headed toward a difficult situation due to a shortage of titanium dioxide. Titanium dioxide is a pigment which is used in decorative paint, for example, to provide a whiteness to the paint. At that point in time, the industry was worried because a key producer of titanium dioxide was leaving the industry altogether or going into a major turnaround or restructuring. I don't remember exactly, but surely there was an industry ready for the worst. People were trying to stockpile, but there wasn't enough TO2 going around, at least of the right quality for everyone. At that point in time, a chemical producer entered the scene and proposed a new generation of ligand, a new polymer, that promised to reduce drastically the need of titanium dioxide needed. So in theory, the solution perfect for the occasion. However, there was a catch. It could not be simply added to the existing formulation. It was supposed to be a totally new reformulation of the paint. So not everybody wanted to get there. A global paint company identified a premium line which was marketed in a separate market, in a separate channel with different brand, and the idea was tried in that specific case. The reformulation happened in a controlled way, and after success, it was then extended to the main market.
Interesting. I like that. Now, let me dig a bit further, onto the perspective of the buyer, right? The perspective of the buyer as those kind of things come. Because, a possible concern, to the proposed way of working, the value creation, value share method, that you're describing, is that maybe it removes leverage from the buyer, right? As most stakeholders join the discussion as well, as the deal become more complex and there are multiple buyer and multiple value indicators. I mean, what are your thoughts?
It is actually a concern we've been facing in real life, Giuseppe, so you are spot on this one. And frankly, I cannot disagree that this comes to mind as an immediate concern. We used to have a lonely room where a buyer and a seller were facing each other, negotiating price or cost, depending on your perspective. Now, all of a sudden, this room gets crowded. More people are walking in. R&D gets involved. Legal gets involved. Operations and supply chain. Not to mention the executives, because the executives will be needed to provide resources, usually to sponsor those proof of concepts, and they also sometimes are needed to remove some barriers, because this kind of approach might be at times disruptive, and therefore the executives will need to bless it, approve it, and they want to be briefed. So at this point, the concern on losing leverage could be seen as something real and very material. However, let me counter that, Giuseppe. I have seen in my experience that those procurement managers who accepted to venture into this approach and accepted to become orchestrator more than individual contributors, actually gained leverage, gained exposure in the organization, because all of a sudden they are not just negotiating a deal on a very reduced set of variables, but they are becoming coordinators of multifunctional working groups, which includes organization and the vendor, so creating automatically more trust, more dialogue, more intimacy, and that can emerge from the exercise as recognized leader for their own organization. Let me also add a provocative thought when it comes to loss of leverage, Giuseppe. Those of us who have been in the chemical industry are following with interest the evolution of a public web e-procurement site, which is called Chemondis. And this is a spin-off of Lanxess. It is not just marketing the Lanxess portfolio, it's also accepting and welcoming third-party vendors, chemical producer, to post their production there. Now, we'll see whether this endeavor succeeds. In the past, there were failures, but if this goes forth, and we have seen a precedent with the Alibaba group doing the same in China successfully, if this really goes and flies, you can see that the transactional part of our job is going to be taken away from us to a large extent, and is going to be managed more like in a stock exchange, where the price discovery will be done by buyers and sellers meeting on the web. So honestly, if you're worried about loss of leverage, maybe that's a place to look at, and maybe it's time to upgrade ourselves into orchestrators instead.
Yeah. Just, a small story. I was having lunch last week with a friend that used to be a sales executive, and now she moved into procurement. And from her own let's say, how do you want to call it, business partner, from the people that she's working with, she's getting, extremely positive feedback in terms, it's never been so easy to work with procurement, in the sense that somehow, she's bringing, this way of thinking of salespeople, of looking at this different way of working as an opportunity, not a threat. While, of course, some of the old school procurement people may still be reluctant, to open up and do things in a broader, different ways. But I know that things are changing. I know that also the procurement function is developing into different way of working, and also the number of KPI is broadening up. Let's say it's not only about cost saving. By the way, before I ask you one more question, I want to remind the audience that it is your LinkedIn life, right? So, I can I can continue to ask questions to Antonio, but it will be even better if you ask your own question. I mean, and I see in the audience people from Africa, people from Europe, people from Asia, so we may even get, I don't recognize any American name, but maybe we also have some American into the audience. Why don't you ask any question that may be relevant? Antonio will be able to give his perspective on this topic. In the meantime, as you think it over, if there is something else you want to share, let me continue, the discussion. And because, once the business case has been approved, we talked about, okay, different way of work. Once a business case is approved, the proof of concept is successful, the project gets founded in a commercial scale, how is the value which has been created is then shared between the party? I think, creating the value, okay, we talked, but then how do you share it without creating tension between the two partners?
Yes, this is really, Giuseppe, where the negotiation comes back. We try to chase negotiation out of the door. Negotiation is coming back from the window. In my view, this is the moment where the parties need to really go back to traditional roles. The short question and the short answer is that the parties will need to find a percentage of sharing out of the value created in the way it has been defined initially and has been measured. through the KPIs that we discussed before. Some of them are financial, as we said, productivity, cost, yield, working capital. Some other might become new generation of scorecard, for example. What is the carbon footprint of your supply? Can we reduce it? The parties need to find a percentage, so to speak. But another way to answer this question is that it's going to be then very, very important to have made a good selection of how the value was defined. If we go back to a very simple example, we could imagine to take the acquisition of filtration devices, which is something that we do here at Merck very, very frequently. One thing is to consider the problem by measuring the unit cost of a new generation filter, for example, versus an old generation, and try to discuss about that. A better place is to say, let's not look into the unit cost in an absolute way, but let's look at the total cost of the filtration operation step throughout the life of the filter, taking into account things like, for example, the flow rate that can be accommodated, the useful surface of the filters, and on, until we come to a better description of what filtration cost is and try to reduce that. An even more ambitious definition of value would be to say, if this is a bottleneck in my process, and through the newer generation filters, we can remove the bottleneck, we could also account for the value created by adding more grams of, for example, biopharmaceutical drug substance into the equation, because the value creation that we are evaluating now goes from 1 to 10,000, depending on where you accept to consider your arena. The cake you are baking can become bigger and bigger, and then the share of the vendor can be smaller in proportion, because in absolute terms will remain viable and interesting. So depending on the value creation choice, it is just a cost exercise, it is a value creation exercise. The percentage will vary. But I would say, in general, a way to maybe sort this out in a way which is not too controversial would be to assume that the two parties will like the way of working this way. If they like it so much that they don't stop at one project, but they create a series of projects, they could say, well, the value created through all those projects in a given year can be used to offset a price increase, for example. And there will be a way to share value, which is going to be possibly satisfactory for both parties as a start.
Okay, Andrea, let me reformulate this to make sure that we understand. So what you're saying is that most of the time you're moving away from this is the price of the filter, or these are the cost of the services, into, let's agree, KPIs, and then define, which percentage will take one party and which percentage take the other party. So the value creation is really the KPI definition, the value sharing is the KPI definition, and then the number which is associated to the two parties. Is that really a frequent model, or is something that you only do in a few cases?
You're on spot, Giuseppe. This demands a substantial amount of resource involvement and a lot of time to define and measure accurately the value creation. So you cannot do this on an individual basis for every SKU that you are selling to your global account. But what you can do is to say, let's collect 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 projects which are truly transformational, truly value creating, and then we can use the whole pot of money that we have generated through those to improve and accommodate the pricing for the overall range that we sell to you, for example, so that there is a price increase on the one hand, but on the other hand, the vendor is contributing resources and people, technicians, and laboratories maybe to generate those savings for you, Mr. Customer, and therefore we can net it out this way. This could be an approach that is simple and can sort out the pricing for a bigger amount of products than the single one where you are exercising yourself into the value creation exercise.
Okay, I see it. Now, if I may, it sounds like the value creating, value sharing concept works well for high-tech industries where the innovation rate is intense. You can make breakthrough changes through new solution that really change the life of the customer. Does that mean that is not applicable in more traditional industries where technology adoption rate is low?
Not necessarily. I would say I would challenge that, Giuseppe. I would say yes, it's true. You might intuitively apply this methodology to industries where there is a rapid pace of innovation, and therefore there is always a old generation and a new generation of services or products where it's easier to calculate your value creation. However, I would not limit at that. We could imagine to actually extend it to low technology industries. The trick is to move away from, strictly speaking, product innovation and try to extend it to process innovation. For example, let's do together something like improving the quality of the forecasting by linking the customer production plan through ERP connection into the vendor planning systems, for example. Or can we improve the payment terms by adopting factoring programs where we put a financial institution in between, and a seller sells the credit and gets paid in 30 days if they want? Or could we imagine to work on VMI programs, for example, that sometimes can be truly value creating? It goes further. If we now imagine to consider the new metrics, for example, we spoke about ESG metrics. Let's work together to reduce the carbon footprint of the packaging that we use in our supplies. Could we imagine to work together in recycling and disposing after use of the remainings of our supply? Let me give you an example. A few years back, a chemical producer came up with the idea of innovating the industrial solvent distribution business, by saying, instead of simply selling solvent, I'm going to also, in the same delivery, take back the spent solvent that you, Mr. Customer, have generated. I'm going to dispose of it on your behalf in an authorized recycling company. I'm going to do the paperwork for you. It is all included in the selling price. So moving from a product business into a service is something that is definitely applicable even to low technology based industries. And that's the way I'd like to encourage our listener to go.
Great. By the way, I don't want to keep running the show on my own. Feel free to run any question. Maybe if you're available, Antonio, I will ask you another couple of questions. Let's see in the meantime if our audience is maybe want to look for an application that applies to their industry. Why don't we start? Why don't we give the word to Sergey? We have a question from Sergey. Let's see. Okay, here we are. I have a general question. I would like your opinion. How do you deal with your account if you find out that they breach the cooperation contract and are operating behind your back without transparency? Interesting one. Okay.
I would say, and I'm just reacting to this, looking into my past experiences, a way where you can sanction this could be to try to isolate the phenomenon, the episode, to a specific product line or specific geography where this has happened, and maybe restrict for the time being that business, that product from global collaborations. Because global collaboration, where significant resources are invested by both parties, really rely on open trust and credibility. We need to trust each other 100% if you want to invest money into making a change to an operation, into a process, into a service. If then we see that the information provided was not accurate, then maybe it is right to give a signal to the counterparty that this is not acceptable. It will not help. It will not help to create further projects going forward. So maybe we restrict that particular episode, that area, that geography, that product for the time being until we clarify, so that we give a strong signal without being too destructive.
Thank you, Antonio. And this question from Sergey, brings us also, the fact that, okay, maybe the buyer is doing something because they don't feel fully comfortable with cooperation. I mean, how do you ensure that over time the relationship remains driven by value creation and there is not over dependence develop on the solution on a specific vendor that you only have to work with them, right? And that's may then create the sort of behavior where the buyer is doing something behind your back or is not operating exactly according to the terms. I mean, what do you see happening in your relationships?
We cannot underestimate this concern. And I'll be frank, this has been one of those that I found myself dealing with in most cases when after 2 or 3 attempts you cannot go through, although the idea sounds very good, you realize by talking to people privately that there is a concern about over dependency on one specific vendor. But I would say these things can be mitigated in several ways. First of all, I would say if the value creation scorecard that we mentioned prior is kept alive and current year after year with the involvement and rubber stamping of finance and the executives, and we consistently we share and consistently demonstrate value creation year after year after year, that's already a strong sign that we are into something big, and this cannot be wrong. If we create value for the customer year after year, this cannot be wrong. If the customer is agreeing on the measurement and they are participating to the approval that yes, we saw those improvements, yes, we saw the yield, yes, we saw the cost, we saw the working capital benefits. And that's already, in my view, the ultimate test of the collaboration being healthy. I would also add another mitigator of concern. The way you devise those exercises can also be extended into, for example, negotiating a long-term supply. So you can and should, as a global account, I guess, expect transparency in the future price of the benefit. So you'll be able to negotiate over the 3, 4, or 5 years what the price will be, maybe based on some parameters, for example, the purchasing volume or other things that can be assessed objectively, and they will keep you safely away from possible troubles, like, for example, the vendor exercising excessive power. But in general, more than that, I would say that in those days, no global vendor, no global supplier is too relaxed, too complacent about having a dominant position, or not even that, but even an entrenched position. There is no such definition anymore. Things are changing very rapidly. An example of that is COVID, as we all know. Many industries have been struggling with lack of capacity, lack of access to consumable or product or chip and semiconductors, and this is shaking the boundaries of how things were getting done before. Now, global accounts, who are very inventive and well-resourced, are asking themselves, do we really need to stick to those guidelines? Do we really need to avoid switching to the new vendor? Do we need to truly use this 10 times and not 20 or 100 times? Who says that? So those things are usually not asked because there is no need, but now global accounts are taking chances, taking more than ever an aggressive look to any sacred cow. Not to mention episodes like, for example, a global account absorbing another company, and by acquiring the new company, a new technology, which is your competitive technology, comes in, fully validated, fully vetted, and all of a sudden, all your expected leverage disappears. In general, I go to the point of saying that the best global companies are the ones who are cannibalizing themselves proactively. So they are proactively going forth, offering better technologies, better products, even if those are more efficient, so remove revenues from the vendor, and they just do it with the intent to remain seen as full of goodwill and truly credible as a strategic partner for their account.
Great, Antonio. Thank you. Just I want to tell our audience that there is another opportunity to be together this week, because on Friday we have a webinar on cross-cultural negotiations. So if the topic of cross-cultural negotiation is interesting to you, then you do have the link on the comment side, and you can check out our webinar. That's maybe, again, another opportunity to continue the learning journey on negotiation. Now, Antonio, you've been really opening up our mind about the world of key accounts and the latest trends in the field. Allow me to ask you one last question, and because and then again maybe this may reassure some of the buyers into the audience that are not yet fully exploiting the benefits of a key account collaboration with strategic vendor, because the sharing of know-how from the buying part, right, from the procurement, may lead to concern of loss of proprietary information. Now, how can they get the party to negotiate a frame that protects from exposure?
The negotiation around IP leakage or prevention of IP leakage is a key one, Giuseppe, for enabling this kind of collaboration. Because you're right, the IP concern will surface sooner or later whenever two important companies work together, because it's not infrequent, and those collaboration can generate something novel, something unprecedented. And then the question that is maybe not immediately on the table, but will come sooner or later, is we develop something great. We are now taking advantage of it, we as customer, you as a vendor in our relationship, but who owns the right to exploit the innovation for the general market, for example? This is a problem that I encountered a couple of times, and it is all due to the fact that this part was not put into the discussion early in the project for the fear of creating too much complexity, or maybe because the results were not so promising to imagine an exploitation of the invention for the general market. However, when this happens and has not been prepared, the result can be devastating. There has been a case where a chemical company and a coating company were working together in a solution to develop inner coat for cans, which was bisphenol free. And that was important. It was a moment of transition for the industry a few years back. The development was promising. The prototypes were looking great, but at a point in time, it became apparent that both partners were assuming that they would be the one retaining the right of exploitation of the invention for the general market. That, as you can imagine, had a devastating consequence on the project. That was put on the refrigerator until this was sorted out. And sorting this out meant to elevate the topic to real executive level, and CEOs were engaged. The discussion was difficult, and the implication of this episode were going far beyond maybe the economic value of the invention itself. And therefore, IP cannot be underestimated. It has to be put on the table relatively quickly, without fear, because by trying to maintain the navigation smooth and not putting it early enough, you risk to have rocking storms down the road that you can do without, frankly.
Amazing. Antonio, thank you very much. I mean, I like very much, how you supported all your points with real life examples that gave us also the opportunity, to understand more about how different industry operate, because, your example came not only from the pharmaceutical world. So thank you very much for being with us. It was really insightful to get your perspective on account management, value sharing, and value creation account management. So thank you very much to you. Thank you very much for our audience to be with us today, and look forward to reconnect with you on Friday for our webinar on cross-cultural negotiation, and then for our next LinkedIn Live on the 30th of September. Thanks again. All the very best.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.